All right, here we go. Part one in what it's like to wake up with severe trauma. Take 75. So this will be the 15th time or something like that I've tried to shoot this video. And I was a little baffled about why that was. And upon reflection, I realized that when that trauma structure collapsed, it really collapsed. And it was almost like it had just erased it in terms of the reactivity and what was coming up, or the lens or the filter through which I viewed stuff, which is nice for me, makes it a little more challenging to communicate. So the idea in this whole series is to just share what it's like to really, really have extreme trauma. Now, everyone goes through trauma, and I don't want to downplay that. So for context, what I'm referencing is the real extreme stuff. Extreme violence, abuse, drug addiction, psychological abuse, a lot of stuff that happens when we're kids, all of those things. And I wrestled with these for a long time. Some I knew about and some I did not. And they didn't come to the forefront until much, much later in this process, actually after some identity shifts and some of the apparent self falling away. And they really, really took me by surprise. And if you would have asked me at any given point in time over the last 10, 15 years that this has been unfolding, I would have told you up until 2 or 3 years ago that I was fine, that whatever had happened to me or however it was I was viewing the world was just normal. The problem was is there's an inherent view underneath that I was having a very hard time looking at. And part of that view said, yeah, I'm awake. But I mean, not really that sort of grand claiming, but okay, yeah, there's been some shifts here and some identity and, so on and so forth. And then just the rest of the world still sucks. Right. So the last few years of movement began to happen completely beyond my control, where that began to unravel. So today I'll cover one of the first ones for me. And I know this can be a big one for other people too. And then I'll cover different ones in subsequent videos. When I was young, in as many ways as my parents could communicate it to me, I was given the message that all of my efforts were not good enough. It didn't matter what I did. There was also some neglect there. My father was in the military, so he was gone a lot, so I didn't have him around. He was always gone for 3 months or 6 months. And my mother, who had been through a tremendous amount of abuse, was left to try to raise me with what I would say would be a very broken skill set. So that got projected onto me. And I can remember what it was like to always want to prove that I was good enough, that I was worthy enough. As I got older, that began to morph into a more sort of a desperate need of very performative, coming from a real place of insecurity, a place of lack. And it said, look at me, look at my stuff, look what I can do, in just about any flavor that you can think of. So when this journey came along and I started practicing and I had some shifts, I drug that in there with me. And as I went along, I found that after, shall I say, for me, the honeymoon period of, ooh, I found this new thing, because getting into this, of course, can really feel like a brand new thing, right? And we can even get some relief from some of the symptoms of this trauma. And of course, the basic sense of identity that everyone struggles with and fights with and against. So there was a newness to it, and I did a lot of meditating and did a lot of concentration practice and had some general relief, but that was really a honeymoon period. And after that settled, and after there had been a number of really big experiences, and then sort of a general settling of it, there was this stuff that was underneath that was just sitting there, untouched, unseen. And eventually, of course, this caused a tremendous amount of frustration, especially because I didn't necessarily know where it was coming from. I didn't know that there was still residual trauma there. But what it looked like was a real strong comparison type of thing. I would watch videos, or I would see teachers and I would see them being very confident, or I would see somebody very freshly out of part of the identity falling away, or seeing through no self, or any of the different sort of things that can happen as we're dissolving this thing, as we're unraveling. And when I was feeling kind of okay and that trauma wasn't activated, it was like, oh, okay. I don't know that I ever felt anything celebratory. I don't know that I was ever actually happy for them. But then when I was really triggered or not, and really struggling at a particular point, I can remember that comparison was like a monster to me. And I would look at my own experience and see the joy that they were having, and see the sense of lightness and the sense of bliss that they were experiencing, and then do this quick sort of check-in here and feel that sort of that trauma ball, feel that part that had been activated, and would have that really reconfirm the sense of not good enough. And then all the subsequent mental images and messages that went with that. I'm never going to get this. How come they have it and I don't? Why can't I be there? They're faking it. That was a big one, accusing people internally of insincerity. And as I did that, there was a small piece that really sort of knew that wasn't the case. And it was like just barely aware that wasn't necessarily entirely true, but that trauma response was in there, was so stuck in there that didn't really matter. Other messages I got were things like the inevitable failure. This is never going to work. Like it's deeper than a thought. It's like a really, really dug in belief. And yeah, I think it's important to point out that when we experience trauma is like the paradigm of identity. It's like a super identity, or it's like the meta person. It's been built upon, and it's been constructed and created in a much more exaggerated way. It's like a caricaturized version. It's like the difference between when David Banner is David Banner, and then when he turns into the Hulk, like in the comic books, and he's just this big, exaggerated version. So that's the structure that gets created through trauma. For me, I sat with it for so many decades that it almost disappeared into the background. It just became what I felt was part of who I was, not because of what I had experienced, but because the rest of the world was still being shitty, right? I would say self-hatred was a very big one in this one too. And again, that lines up with, that confirms what I learned as a child. And when we experience some of these traumas, especially like the early ones, when we're kids, these things are trained into us during our formative years by what I would consider to be relative gods, these gigantic authority figures, parents, grandparents, whoever were our caretakers at the time. And their word is law, and it's absolute. So if you're told that you're not good enough times, that's just how it is. Even though I would notice a natural sense of, it doesn't feel quite right. how do I counteract this? I've seen this in myself, and I've seen this in other people, that when this type of thing gets activated, and many times I think it can be really, really subconscious, is that we have natural coping mechanisms. And it's no different when we move into, shall we say, the awakening arena. Hiding behind non-dual language is a great one. I think first we tell it to ourselves. I mean, you hear it, right? Your teachers, your gurus, the very eloquent speakers, the very popular speakers, many of them will tell you there's no self. There's no one here. There's nothing to do. This used to frustrate me a lot. And it's not as if what they're saying isn't accurate. It's just that when we're dealing with that meta personality, that trauma paradigm, that it's ineffective against this deep internal training. You know, it's just, it's like little tiny toothpick arrows at a great big stone statue. It's not going to make a dent in that sense of identity at all, not even a little bit. Again, what I keep coming back to is that I was unaware of this dynamic until I felt like I was really almost, my hand was forced by life into look at this. And when I was in the middle of it, I guess you could call that a dark night. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the sort of romantical, the romantic language, but is what it is. So we'll call it a dark night. So I absorbed spiritual language, and I used that as a weapon against my own trauma. Tremendous amount of repressing emotions, especially when we're hearing other folks gauge, or apparently the interpretation is we're gauging what their level of realization is based on what we see as their level of reactivity. So, of course, nobody that goes on and makes a YouTube video or writes a book, you can't see them during their everyday life. You can't see whether they get irritated, what irritates them. You can't see them lose their temper, or you can't see them cry, or you can't see them get frustrated, or you don't see them get sad or scared. So it creates this model by which we compare ourselves, and we go, oh, I'm feeling all these emotions that I don't know where they're coming from. All I know is I feel it's just extremely activated, but now it's coming up against my language, my model that I've created. And of course, we're going to create a model, because when you create a model like that, there's nothing wrong with it. I feel like it's really, really quite innocent. We create a model that tends to be the antithesis, the opposite of how we've been plugged in. So there will be, if it's this type of trauma, then there will always be validation, or you will always feel good enough, or if it's around safety, physical safety, you will always feel safe, and that your psychological state and your physical body will never be threatened again, and it will all be bliss, so on and so forth. And we create our own specific models. When in reality, all of those are just coping mechanisms. And what became clear here, but didn't become clear until much later in the process, is that I needed to see these repressed emotions. If I needed to create a mental picture of it, which has its downfalls and benefits. At first, sorry to digress, at first it can become a mental picture, but then eventually it should become energetic. I'll get into that in a second. If I needed to create a mental picture about this thing, where I could visualize that this trauma, these feelings were simply the unresolved stuff that was stored in the body, that were about the same age as whenever they happened. So they were a little version of me. It was like a small child, and this small child keeps coming forward and asking for attention. Hey, I need to be seen. I need to be met. I need to be felt through. I don't want to be told to leave anymore. I don't want to be pushed out of the room. And this, whilst it paints a very, very pretty picture, also runs up against our defense mechanisms, because we remember what it felt like when that trauma was put on us and the subsequent events after that through our lives as we enacted that false sense of, in this case, not good enough, inadequate, less than, unworthy. And now we're being asked to feel it again. So right away, the mind recoils in horror of like, okay, so what you're telling me is all I've done is feel uncomfortable because of this. And now, even if I'm not aware of this trauma or not, but generally speaking, I hear all these speakers talking about place your attention in the body, be with a sensation. No, fuck that. Why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. I don't need to do it. I'm a grizzled veteran. I've got an arm full of stripes. You know, I don't need to do that. Or not, I don't need to. I'm not going to, period. So that's a normal, justifiable reaction. I cannot offer advice on this. Not necessarily a how-to. I feel like that's dangerous. I feel like all of my words need to be taken with a grain of salt. I feel like trauma counselors are super useful. What I can do is tell you how it unfolded here, and that's all I can do. There was something here that happened at some point, and I don't really remember when, but it was something along the lines of me, whether you want to call it a prayer or a mantra or saying it to myself, where at the really, really down here coming from my heart, where I said, I'm willing to feel uncomfortable. I'm willing to be in discomfort. And that was very scary to do. There seemed to be some kind of switch that flipped or some kind of magic for me when that happened. And many times later, I regretted it because it felt like I had opened the floodgates for something. Because every time one of these things would be triggered, and I had heard other people talk about, okay, see if you can just take the attention that's normally up here in the thought space and in the coping mechanisms and in the comparisons and in that super identity and move it to wherever it is that we're feeling it in the body, right? I'm sure you've heard this before. I can't stress how effective I think that is. And stay there for however long you can stay there. There's absolutely not a goal. There's not a specific time limit. It's 5 seconds. It's 5 seconds. That's a success. That's a win. Because these things are stored in the body, it also became very, very apparent to me that there's a finite amount of this stuff in there that wants to be felt through. It can't and won't go for forever. That's just not the way it works. But it does want to be felt through. And even though it feels like fucking death when it's happening, it's grace, I suppose. It's a bonus from life. It's life saying, okay, we want some resolution to this. We want to bring all of this into the light. I don't know if that's everybody's path, shall we say. I have heard stories about teachers that, or speakers or people who've gone through this process that maybe didn't uncover repressed emotions until, until long, long, long way down the road. Most of them seem to be very surprised. It just seemed here that everything was going to stop in terms of shedding further layers of identity, in terms of clarity, in terms of daily peace, and just feeling fucking comfortable in my skin. That, and because the trauma here was so severe, that this stuff needed to be felt through. So what I can say is that in this, and I almost feel like I'm speaking to me 5 years ago or 10 years ago, there's a weird redemptive aspect of this, is that this doesn't have a specific rate. It doesn't have a specific amount per, you know, it doesn't, it's not like there's a specific serving size of these emotions that we have to get at a certain time. It can be taken in little micro chunks or little bits and then withdraw. Even though we might have the mind screaming at us that this is not the way the awakening thing is going to go, and this is not the way our, we had all of this planned out. It is completely okay to stop, to give ourselves a pass, to go, I'm just not going to push, or that's enough, or I can just nibble at this. And it's really important to be hip to that intuition. Now, the problem with the not good enough is that also, the side effect of that is that we have dulled our intuition, which tends to, in one form or another, I think, sort of wake back up again once we've been in this process for a while. So it's something to take note of, is that intuition might be asleep, but it can look like something just says that's enough. The most simple version, and the way it was shared with me, was whatever the body needs. For me, the way the body's plugged in here, that would be things like naps. That's, when I could nap, take a breather, take a break, little indulgences. Clearly things like drugs and alcohol were off the table for my addictive personality, but something like milk and cookies, which is a real thing for me, get in there. Wouldn't, just having milk and cookies for dinner. And it was strange how powerful that was, to just permission. This is good enough. Permission to do this. It can look like movement, i.e., exercise, walking, some of the TRE modalities. I did a lot of the hopping up and down and shaking my arms out and stuff, and just kind of flailing around in the air. That seemed to get things moving as well too. Not watching videos, not doing the comparison thing, going outside, barefoot and in the grass seem to be one of my favorites. So if you're in an environment where that's possible, or barefoot in something, highly recommend it. So that's the first one. Next time I would like to cover, I think we're going to cover safety and violence, and how the body responds when it's really activated through trauma, and then what that looks like through the awakening process. So if you enjoyed this, please give a comment and a share. Thank you so much for being here. Be blessed.